Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Prime Minister's questions comes to an end there with a question from Tim Farron, the Lib Dem leader, on the migrants issue, which had come up earlier when the Prime Minister referred to those in the Calais campus, a bunch of migrants. We may come back to the use of that phrase in a minute. As expected, the Leader of the Opposition went on the Google tax settlement, which has been making the news over the past, 48 hours now. Probably make that 72 because it'll make the news tomorrow as well. Jeremy Corbyn just raising the question as well, has the HMRC really raised enough, as much as it could have done, over a tax settlement that goes back to 2005 with a country that generates billions of pounds every year? The Prime Minister retorting that it had not paid any tax under Labour and that I guess the general line of the government is 130 million is better than nothing. And it went back and forward a little bit like that. Let's hear from our experts in a minute, but first of all, let's hear how you reacted to PMQs, Joko.
Yes, well, the Google tax settlement angered many of our viewers, unsurprisingly. Thomas McNally says, can I pay 3% tax like Google on my earnings? Hayden Richards says, love it, 10 minutes in and Cameron is losing his rag. Also, I'm one of the ones who'd like to pay the same rate of tax as Google. Thanks for the great show, by the way. Martin Bristow, Labour and Corbyn are returning to the spite and envy agenda. Cameron reading out the litany of prominent Labour figures was powerful stuff. The Prime Minister handled this attack with ease. This from John Glenn, it is becoming pitiable. I actually feel sorry for Jeremy Corbyn. Cameron savages him most weeks and makes him look weak and ill-suited to the role. Maldwyn Dobbs says Mr Cameron jumping on this question of Google to try to equate Google in 2009 and Google today shows just how bad he is at fairness. And there was some fury from MPs in the House of Commons on the Prime Minister's use of the phrase bunch of migrants. Chuka Umunna, the Labour MP, tweeted saying it's inflammatory and unbecoming of his office, shameful. Diane Abbott, another Labour MP, says it was callous. Was that appropriate language, Ed Vaizey?
Well, look, we often have debates about the language used either by the Prime Minister or indeed other prominent politicians, particularly in the cauldron of the House of Commons, which you know well, PMQs, you're under a lot of pressure, 400 MPs baying at you. And I often find it's an excuse for not actually debating what the real issue is. And the real issue is, should we allow people who are camped in Calais simply to come to this country? And I think the Prime Minister, in terms of the immigration policy, is getting it absolutely right. He's going to the camps in Syria. He's helping there. As you know, we've got a huge overseas aid budget as well, helping Syrian refugees.
But was it regrettable language?
Look, we always talk about language. People will have their views. The Prime Minister was making the point that he doesn't agree with Jeremy Corbyn, that the people camped in Calais should come to this country, be given a free pass.
Does that include unaccompanied children now? Because there was talk at the weekend that the government may agree to some unaccompanied children coming in.
Yeah, I've seen that talk, and I gather it is an issue that is being considered. I don't know when a conclusion we reached about that. And again, there are a range of different issues you have to take into account, the kind of law of unintended consequences, if you like. But it's certainly an issue that the government wants to look at and see what it can do to help.
It's hard. I can see in some way where the Google story goes now, because Apple, Facebook, Amazon are in the line for the same sort of treatment as well. And I guess HMRC will come under pressure to be a bit tougher with those that are still outstanding. But given HMRC is bound not to release the details of how it's calculated the 130 million, I'm not exactly sure where this story goes next.
In terms of new events and actually consequences of all the sort of political anger, it's not clear either. But I think what Jeremy Corbyn did, a spikier Jeremy Corbyn today, I think what he will succeed in doing is keeping this going for another 24 hours, keeping this in the public eye. This is something that really winds up members of the public. There's no question about that. But at the same time, David Cameron was very well prepped for that attack. It was almost inevitable he was going to go on that. Reading out this list of senior members of the former Labour government who are now working for financial firms, of course, was designed to embarrass Jeremy Corbyn on this, with the attack that Labour didn't do anything about this either. But I think it is the kind of issue where Labour think they can make some ground just by keeping the story going and appearing that they're on the side of the ordinary person who looks at this and thinks, hang on a minute, this isn't fair.
Because the government needs all the money it can get. So, I mean, there was a kind of implication that the government was too close to Google, and there's certainly a lot of personal contact. But it may be a bit of a stretch to think that the closeness has resulted in a lower tax bill than they otherwise would have had.
Jeremy Corbyn was sort of almost suggesting there, by talking about ministerial contacts between the firms, that there was some kind of interference. Now, I agree with you. I think that's a bit of a stretch.
It'd be a great story if it was true.
It would be a great story if it was true, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. But I think when we look at the sort of life cycle of this story, this was perhaps the mistake, was by claiming this as a victory. George Osborne on his Twitter feed and then various briefings to the papers over the weekend, he put himself in this story, asked for the credit, and then it turns out not to have been such a triumph after all in the public mind. And then he's left in a slightly awkward position. You can't, or it's difficult politically to claim credit for something, and then when it doesn't turn out to be such a triumph, say, well, actually, it was nothing to do with me.
Did Number 10 distance themselves?
Look, I think after the coverage over the weekend, Number 10, we're not going to go on the record and say, of course, yes, this was a completely marvellous success. I think, as ever, these things are sometimes overdone. Shall I say they were slightly more careful
If Mr.
with their
Osborne
language.
hadn't tweeted it out, he wouldn't have politicised it in the same way, would he?
I think there still would have been a bit of a rumpus.
Oh, yes.
But not in the same way.
Yvette Cooper, as we speak, has raised as a point of order the Prime Minister's remark, bunch of migrants. I thought it was surprising that the Prime Minister used, I think he was in full flow and probably a bit angry by this time, and sometimes you say things you don't mean to, but having just announced the Holocaust Memorial, to then talk about a bunch of migrants, I think maybe particularly jarred. I was also surprised, not just by the Prime Minister using it, but by Jeremy Corbyn not just taking a segue to react to that, given that Mr. Corbyn had been in the camps and called for unaccompanied children, for Britain to be more generous. Did he miss an opportunity there?
I was shocked when I heard the Prime Minister say it. It was offensive, it was hurtful, it was divisive. It's not the first time we've heard David Cameron slip up in this way, and I would have thought, I appreciate what you say about the heat of the moment, but this kind of language, when you're the Prime Minister, it is so important to get it right. Jeremy too is under pressure in the heat of the moment and Prime Minister's questions, and a lot in his mind about how he manages his time. But I think we were all really taken aback, actually, in silence by what the Prime Minister said.
Except that Mr. Corbyn had been there.
Yeah.
He had seen the state of that camp, which I understand is appalling. The Prime Minister hasn't been there. And there is this issue we're talking about with Ed Vaizey a minute ago as to whether we should not be more generous in our treatment of unaccompanied children, some of whom would be in that camp.
I think we should be speaking out really clearly from a moral position about our obligation to those very, very vulnerable children at every opportunity. And I think that what Jeremy saw in the camps will have absolutely brought home to him the horror of what those people fleeing persecution are going through. So I think we should be looking for opportunities across all parties, both to use the right language, but to develop the policies that will bring these children to safety as quickly as possible.
As this goes on, though, Laura, the run-up to the referendum, indeed even the negotiation and up to the February summit and then beyond, the backdrop of developing events in Europe could be horrendous, and particularly horrendous for those who want this country to stay in Europe.
Indeed, and there's no question that is very much on ministers' minds, and that is part of the reason for the now what is urgency about trying to get this deal done in February, partly because the expectation is that in the coming months and then of course through the summer, the huge volumes of people and the distress that we see night after night on our television screens is not going to get any better, and in fact it may get even worse. And I think politically, of course, the situation is so much more acute now. Now also we see the kind of chaos but also sort of suffering in European capitals. You know, this is no longer what we see, a question about people sort of moving at the edges of Europe. This is, indeed, this is now places where the British voters are sort of familiar with and might have been on holiday. And that might sound a sort of crass thing to say, but this is absolutely part of the calculation that ministers are very well aware of, the broader canvas of what's going on in the world when we actually choose whether or not to stay or leave the EU. will, in a lot of people's minds, actually be much more significant of what the campaigns themselves
will
can
be.
actually influence.
Right. We'll leave it there. Laura, thank you.